about picking hops has two reactions of people. It seems like everybody in this neighborhood, uh, all around Salem and Marion County, picked hops in their youth. Some hated it and some loved it. But it was not always very pleasant. As I said, you went out in the morning early when it was cold and wet, and you worked real fast to get a hop stick before they warmed up. Then it got real hot for the rest of the day. It was also necessary to wear long sleeve blouses or shirts because the fronds of the hops scratched. They were very, very coarse. And you had to tape your gloves, all your fingers, at least the first two, and your thumb with electrician's tape. And
you see, we also need to talk about independence up here on the east side of the river, so this will also work well.
hello, my name is Adele Egan. I'm here to talk about the payday at the hop farm. My dad and his brother and their father had a hop farm near the community of Hopmere, north of Salem, for many years. That was back in the early days, around the Depression and before. But before we get to payday, we better start back at the very beginning, where the people actually were out picking the hops and getting their tickets. Hop picking always started early in the morning. The people liked to get out early while it was still damp. There was dew on the hops, and they weighed heavier. So everyone tried to get one way up early in the morning before the sun dried out the hops. They would call for the weigh-ups. A team went around with scales on a tripod. The baskets would be emptied into a sack, and the sack would be hung on the scale and weighed. Then, usually it was my dad, he carried this punch around on his belt, and he would take out his packet of tickets. It was a book, and there was a top part that he kept and a bottom part that was torn off for the picker. They had a series of numbers, and he could punch in, say, a 40 and a 8 and show that they had picked 48 pounds. Then he tore off the bottom part and gave it to the picker. The children also went out with the parents in the morning, even though it was very early, and stayed for the day. They had little baskets that they could pick in. They might only get one basket in a day, but they thought that was great. And as soon as they got their basket full and tipped it into their folks' basket, they could go on and play the rest of the day. Everyone tried to get, 4 to 8 baskets. They only got 1 cent a pound, but then the grower only got 3 cents a pound. So actually, even at 4 baskets, they only made about $1 a day. But this was important to them. Lots of these people, families I should say really, went out on a vacation for a holiday, and they made enough money for the children to have school clothes and the little extra niceties. It wasn't always pleasant going out and picking. As I said, it was cold in the morning, it was wet, it got damp, the hops were sticky, they scratched your arms, and they had big arms on them, swung around, and they would catch you in the face and scratch your face. Everybody wore long sleeves, even though it was hot because of the scratches. You always wore gloves and had your fingers taped with electrician's tape, at least the thumb and 2 fingers. If your gloves wore out, then you just taped your fingers and did the same thing. Some of the pickers were very careful how they picked, and certain varieties were more to their liking because they could pick each one of the little hop fruits. Others liked the varieties that they could strip, and they would strip out long arms and fill our baskets very quickly. Of course, they had to pick out any extra large leaves, but they didn't take out any more than the boss allowed. At the end of the day, the people would go back to the campgrounds, and we had 2 campgrounds. One was a tent camp, and one was of cabins. At the end of the season, everyone lined up at the office. It was a separate building a few feet away from the home. At that time, they would turn in all their tickets, and my mother would sit at the roll-top desk with this adding machine. This adding machine is made by the American Can Company, and so we called it the tin can. She would sit there by the hour, ringing up these tickets. She got very fast at this, and it was a very good type adding machine. So that when she had added them all up, then my father wrote the check for the people.
I mean, we need, the focus of this is on you as individuals and what you know about the hop industry, how things work, kerosene lanterns, wagons, trains, coming up by boats, whatever, going back and coming forward. So whenever you're ready.
I think I can shut the doors and turn the air conditioner on. It's getting warm.
Well, I'm sure most of you have heard this story, but a friend of mine, Cecil Edwards, who's a retired legislative historian, tells the story of the history of how when people would have a beverage to drink, they would clink glasses or mugs together. And I asked him one day if he knew where that tradition came from. And he said, well, of course it started in government. He said during Roman and Greek times, senators poisoned each other with such frequency that the only way they could trust each other is they would imbibe on the senator's government buildings would be to walk up and clang their tankards or mugs together so that one fellow slopped out over into the other one and the other one slopped into his, and that's where the first word of a political alliance came from, because they knew that at that moment he wasn't trying to poison you because you were drinking some of his and he was drinking some of yours. So as we talked about, that was the first known recorded instance of hops being used for dyes, medicines, and in beverages. And then there were wild hops here in the United States, again, as I'm sure you know. In the Northwest, there were various forms of yarrow plant, and it was one of the reasons the Native Americans and the early pioneers had such success in curing salmon bundles, as they would take a bunch of wild hops and put them inside salmon and jerky bundles, and that made them keep so they could trade them over the mountains in the Klamath Falls and so forth. And then we want to talk about, here comes the Oregon Trail and bringing the European strains to Oregon for the hops we know today as the European variety. So Mr. Kerr, would you start off and just talk about your early family involvement and knowledge of hops in the Willamette Valley or Oregon?
Well, I guess the first experience I had was running around barefooted on my dad's hop yard. We had pictures taken of the crew out in the yard during hop picking. And I know I was pretty young because they made me, this good-looking little blonde girl made me sit on her lap, and I cried because I had to sit on her lap, so you know I was pretty young. That was my first experience, I think, in the hop industry. Then we went on from that after my dad passed away, and I later started, I grew my first hops 64 years ago, my first crop. And that was down at St. Paul with I think it started in with 18 acres and then gradually built it up a bit. From there, later moved up to Mission Bottom and grew hops there for several years. Sold the farm then to my son, and he in turn sold it to my two grandsons that are here. So we've got a 4th-generation operation going, and there's the picture over there that shows the four of us. Mike not happen to be in that one, but he has his son too that's in it. And they're taking over now, so I've backed out of it, watching the endeavors that these young fellows are putting into it.
What were some of the names of some of the horses, do you remember, that you used during those days?
Baldy was one, and Madge was another one. They were our prize team. This Baldy had a bald face, that's where he got his name. And you could always tell when it was getting close to lunchtime. It just seemed like he would speed up, and you'd know by looking at yeah, it's getting near lunchtime, and the same way about quitting time. He had a knack of knowing that it was getting time to get going for home, and he'd always speed up. I well remember that.
What breed of horses were they?
Perchins.
Perchins, mostly, yeah. Did you do, or your family do, most of the shoeing and all that?
Dad was more or less of a veterinarian. I can remember people bringing horses to him to break. And I can remember him throwing them in the barnyard and he used a can full of rocks and stuff to intimidate them till they get over their nervousness, and cutting the tail off to drain their blood to get it recirculated again and things like that. He used to, they'd bring something they couldn't handle, they'd bring it over to Dad, and he'd work it over and then give it back to him.
Did he use a corral and a snubbing post, do you recall?
Yeah, he had one. Yeah.
And so the horses he would work with would be mainly to break them to a team, not to a buggy, but to a working stock.
Working stock,
Okay.
Gentle them down so anybody could handle them. I can remember one big black mare that they brought over one time, and when Dad got through it, I was driving it as a kid. So whatever you did worked, I guess.
Was there a lot of trading, and if so, what was a going price for a horse then?
Gosh, I can't remember that. Been so long ago.
Sure.
I couldn't tell you anymore.
Any of the rest of you, while we're on the subject of teams and horses, remember stories or incidences of?
I was just thinking, Ray was talking about blacksmithing and shoeing, and you were asking him. The blacksmith shop in St. Paul was a very interesting place for me as a young man, or when I was in grade school. A fellow by the name of Joe Eaton, whose son was later a state policeman for years, and who's on down the boys played for New York Giants, one of football, one of the Noble boys, and it was always an attraction for us kids at school to go over and watch him shoe horses. And the rodeo at St. Paul kind of started in this same blacksmith shop with guys sitting around talking and in the horse business. I had an uncle named Bill Smith who didn't grow hops, but he was a terrific horseman, and every horse in the country seemed to have a finger on, and if anybody came through town that had a horse, or I know one time there was a guy who came along and he had a nice saddle and a pretty good horse, and my Uncle Bill bought his saddle and his horse for $50. I don't know how he got out of town afterwards, hitchhiked I guess, but anyway, it was a pretty good horse. But we were much the same as Ray, horses pulling wagons and hauling hops, and always, there was a gentleman there named Pepper Martin in St. Paul.
Oh, yeah. That-
And he hauled hops, and Blitz Weinhardt made a half-gallon little beer thing then, a beer jug, and that was about what it took for him to haul hops all day. At noon he'd pick up that half-gallon jug of beer, and he'd have a wet sack to keep it cold. We had a store in our hop growing area, and probably 500 pickers in cabins. My mother ran the hop store, which was a great attraction for us too, to get into the ice cream and the soda pop and all that. We thought we were fabulous help around that hop store. But it was very enjoyable in those days to we kids. There was always a big straw pile around from wheat or harvesting, and some farmer nearby had watermelon patches that he tried to hide from the hop pickers, and we always found them early and got into those watermelon patches, which Brentanos there had watermelons, and we were out there. We'd just plug them, you know, to see which ones were ripe, cut a little square in them. And we figured if he ever caught us, we were just going to be killed right there on the spot, because they said that he had a gun, and if he ever caught us in that watermelon patch, we'd had it. So we're out there one day just plugging watermelons, and here he came with a shotgun on him, and we thought we were dead. But he just suggested to us that when the stem was pretty dry, they were ripe enough, and not to keep cutting them open and leaving them there, you know. And we got a melon or two and got the hell out of there. We thought we were lucky still to be alive.
Do you remember the wagons? Did you, when they came from the wagon dealer, was it just the rig, the tongue, and the wheels, and you had to build a box? Or would you
Pretty
recall-
much, I think,
Yeah.
built their own boxes.
Right,
Yeah, just the chassis came, steel wheeled, you know.
right.
And, in ours, there was a big long ramp going up to the dryer, and there was a chute there that they put the tongue in, and they pulled them up by cable. And the team would come and unhook the wagon and stick that tongue in that chute, then go down on the other end with a pulley and pull that wagon up. Oh, I suppose it was 20 feet in the air up to those kilns, you know. And of course, that was part of the height of the drying height. This was Michael Claude's dryer down there. In our area, we had floods, and then I think in some of these areas in the winter, so it was quite a little problem too in those dryers. And in the hop yards, the poles would get washed out. And of course, there was lower trellis in those days, and hop training on the wire, and sleds and horses on those. My dad had a horse. She was a Percheron mare, and World War II came along, and she was just scared to death of airplanes. And a low-flying airplane just set her off running. My dad on a stringing cart, you know, sled. They had a hell of a time with her, you know. She'd want to run away when a plane came over. So I thought that was kind of in the 40s there, early.
Mr. Becker, what your experiences with
Well, I didn't have too much to do with the horses. I drove the tractor. No, really, when I first started, I was, well, it was 1925. I was down on a ranch owned by Williams and Hart, down on the Willamette River, just side of Westerville. And I got to be water boy during harvest season. And when I become 14, I was a check boy.
which was?
And we lived there for, well, in 1945 I left the ranch and went to buying hops in Salem. And from there, I went down to Oregon City, run the Oregon City ranch, the old Seaview ranch they had down there, for Cola McLeod. And from there I went to Hermiston and ran a ranch for Ray had an interest in it. And I was there 10 years. And when they sold, I went to John Ihaw's ranch in Mabton, Washington. And I stayed there for 10 years. And from there I retired.
He mentions that Oregon City yard, and I know the flood that wiped out Vanport got in that, didn't it, in 48 there?
Yes,
In that
yes,
yard.
yes. Well, it was flooded several times.
Yeah, right.
Notice you're always blending the hops with the watermelons. I like that. You start-
It was on a pole and along, and you've probably seen them, and you held it up and weighed the sacks. And
It'd be a PV weight with a hook and
yes,
weights you could
right.
add.
And the wire down thing in those days, there was a wire down fellow that dropped the wires in the hand picking days, and with a long pole with a little hook on it, and you drop the wire down, and then use jacks to jack it up in the air about 5 or 6 feet so they could pick into those baskets that they placed right under. And normally 2 baskets made a sack, and anywhere from 25 pounds to the basket up to, if they chopped it down a little bit, 60, 70 pounds to a sack.
Yeah, I can remember weighing, some of the pickers would be so ambitious that they wouldn't want to, they used to have to punch a ticket for them, how many pounds their sack weighed. And they wouldn't take the time to take their ticket out of their pocket. The girls would just turn around like that, and you'd have to reach in the back pocket, get their ticket, punch it, and put it back in their pocket, and they'd keep right on to picking. They didn't want to lose time.
I had a cousin that was an extremely good picker, this young lady, and quite a nice looking young lady. She's married to a cousin of mine, but usually she was just being kicked out of a hop yard for picking dirty when you'd see her, and going on to another yard till they caught up with her again. And she could pick so many hops you couldn't believe, and the quality of her picking, if they allowed her to do that, pretty soon the other pickers would see that quality.
Right.
Just because she was good looking. They didn't want to let her get by with that because they couldn't pick as many hops as her.
When you say picking dirty, would that include pouring water from your canteen
No,
in, or
just
dirt
leaves
or
and-
rocks and
leaves and stems.
Leaves and stems.
She was
Talking
picking-
about dirty hops, take the sack and pull it up, put it on the scale, you know, and all of a sudden your knee had hit something solid.
Mhm.
I found pears and I found apples.
Clods.
Clods and everything else in there, see, try to get by with.
And the sack would be wet, maybe, in
Yeah.
the morning, and
Yeah.
things like that. All neat little tricks.
Mhm.
And they were picking probably a 22, 23% pick. And it came down in later years, in the 40s there, we had to have 8% to get by. And you just couldn't hardly get pickers to pick that clean and make any money whatsoever. So
Right.
That's what brought the picking machines in. They couldn't make any money and therefore didn't come out, so we had to do something else.
Well, a lot of times I've seen pickers out there at daylight and leave not later than, by 4 o'clock, and so make 75, 80 cents.
there were a lot of Russians from areas of Portland that came out in our time and
Mhm.
picked, and maybe the father would have a job in Portland and the mother and the children would be all out picking, and he'd come out on the weekends. And we of course had this store, and in fact we had a policeman there. It was like having a town. It's bigger than the town of St. Paul is today, our hop picking area. So it was quite a family tradition, and we had a lady in Portland that contacted people to get pickers, and I think most everybody did in our area.
Country boys would chase the city, kick girls, and vice versa.
Yes.
Well,
Straw piles of
we
catch
used to haul winos out of Portland too, truck them out.
Yeah.
Every day.
Tell me a bit more about your store. Was that open year round or just for the
No,
hop
just
picking?
during hop picking.
Okay.
About 30 days or whatever, and they had a complete line of groceries, and then a meat truck came through from St. Paul, Clem Vanderweel, and various things, and there'd be fresh meat, and of course there were vegetables, like I say, the gentleman with the watermelons and sweet corn and things like that around, that they came in fresh every day, and but it was a complete stock, and soda pop and candy and ice cream, and cigarettes were about 10 cents a pack, as I recall.
Lots of times the pickers would eat too much fruit and everything, and then they'd blame it on the water.
Yeah,
Right,
right.
right. Do you have pictures of the store?
Gosh, I don't know.
It'd be great if we could find some. I just want to
There may be
note
some.
on the tape. It'd be great. Where is it physically located?
Out of St. Paul, about 2.5 miles towards the river, and the river was right behind us, so
Okay.
that was the bathing facility for a lot of hop pickers in the evening.
Okay.
They swam in the river. Showers weren't too readily available in those days. Plumbing wasn't really up to date.
Adele Egan talked about, in her day, she said they would either use cheap cotton gloves and wrap electrician's tape around the thumb and the 2 fingers.
Right.
Tell me about the gloves people used, and did everybody use gloves or tape, or what did people do? How did they?
Oh, I think all types of gloves, and some people, hops gave them a kind of a rash and a problem. Some people it didn't. And
Lots of people took a stocking,
Right.
cut the end of it off, and used the stocking to cover the ladies, cover their arms, and then they'd sew the socks together between the fingers, and then, like you say, they'd tape their fingers.
Mm-hmm.
When the hops hang down in stringers, early days when they weren't so careful, they'd get up on the stringer pretty high and just strip that whole thing down in the basket. That's where they got the dirty hops from.
Dirty hops from.
Yeah.
Was in the 20s and 30s, was it about a penny a pound? Was that about, Adele said that they're about, she recalled during that time, Adele Egan, that it was about 3 cents a pound, and the grower got a cent, and the labor contractor got a penny, and she wasn't too sure. I just,
No, we started out at 3/4 of a cent.
3/4 of a
As I
cent.
recall, 3/4 of a cent. Oh, probably for 2 or 3 years as I was in the business, and
A cent a pound.
then it went to a cent.
Was the going price after that
Yes.
for many
Mhm.
years.
Mhm.
Normally, I think if they stayed the whole season, they got a bonus,
Yeah.
maybe a
Mhm.
quarter of a
What
cent.
did it end up with? About
Yeah,
five cents,
I
wasn't
think
it?
so.
Mm-hmm. That was about the last
19
price before picking machine.
1950, 52, right?
And an average
Got me
season
there.
would last about how long?
30 days.
Something like that.
On the bigger place.
So talk to me about picking. If you came out the first day and go ahead and talk to me about how much you could make over the 30 days and how much it cost you to live there. Just give me a little bit of insight on.
Well, that depended on the pickers. There was some that could pick a lot faster. We had one fellow that could make his $10 every day. Somebody right alongside him make $1 a day.
Mhm.
You know, it was just it was a very knack to be able to pick $10 worth of hops in a day. I'll tell you.
And they'd have baskets scattered along and sacks scattered along, and maybe somebody'd be dumping them for them, and maybe they'd get the weigh guy to do it, and they'd just be going like a machine, you know,
Right.
and somebody'd be dumping them in the sacks for them, and it was amazing what some
Mhm.
people could do.
Most of the people had campgrounds where they came out. Of course, a lot of them brought tents and so forth, but a lot of people had cabins, so there didn't cost anything to live. But
Right.
that was furnished by most of the growers.
Mhm.
As a young person, I always enjoyed the blackjack games in the evening,
Yes.
that sort of thing.
If we could talk about, because there are, we've identified probably 9 different ways of immigrants that have come to the valley. I'm Welsh, Irish, German. In fact,
Indians.
In the 1840s, when my grandparents came over, some were German and some were Welsh. The second language wasn't English among the Indians in Kansas, it was German. And they're saying, "Spricken Sie Deutsch." So, and there were Indians, Russians, Italians, Scandinavians, in more recent years, some Filipinos, and Hispanics. Some of the myths, that at least that people have told us about, I read about, is that the Russians were sought after often because they were really good at, and tell me what that was, about twirling the hop vine near the top of the wire.
Springing
Training.
Training.
and training.
Do you recall any of that? Was that a,
Most of ours were local people,
Okay.
drive in, and a lot of women
Mhm.
involved
Mhm.
in the stringing of hops and in the training.
Well, back in those days, I think everybody was local until harvest come, and then you got
right.
the other.
Some of the, there's a couple of women named the Hudson sisters that used to pick in Mission Bottom, and they're about 94 now. And they said that their family were sought after because they were clean pickers.
Mhm.
The women made the kids' mind, she said, and they also wove baskets and sold them, they said, in the hop fields. And they were part of the Indian tribes that were driven out during the Indian Wars and have the chevron blue tattoos on their chin, which their dads put on them to keep them from going with white fellows because they were part of the chief's family.
That was before our time, though.
Yes, yeah, it was.
Well, that ranch that you had up there in Hermiston, Ray, before you bought it, a few years back from that, the Indians tribe from Yakima picked that whole thing.
But she said their whole family would come from all over Oregon, from Yakima down, to join them during hop harvest and pick.
I know that a lot of areas in Washington hauled the Indians out of British Columbia
Right.
every year. A friend of mine who later became a cowboy from the Yakima area, that was one of the first jobs he had, hauling those Indians down
Really?
to pick hops. And
Here, most of them would have come. We're from Portland, either an Old
Yeah.
Town area or from Confederate tribes of Grand Ronde or Silet, somewhere like that.
we didn't have very many Indians in our time.
I don't recall of any.
No.
No.
Mostly Russians, like
Right.
out of-
Italians, someone mentioned from Portland, Italian families.
Out of Portland, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Whoever wanted to come.
Sure.
We had a mixture.
out on Killingsworth there, out in that area.
Right.
Yeah.
A Filipino family came in and brought some photos. Nabria
Mm-hmm.
that I think worked for the Kerr family for a while. Maybe Tablonza. Maybe
Tablonza.
that's the name.
Oh,
Yes.
Pete drove to Blonza.
Yes. Yes.
And he came over, he started in 1929 on the farm the boys and the grandsons have now, and worked for the people before I bought it. It was known as the Arch German Ranch.
Oh, okay.
And I bought it in 1950, and he continued working for me after he finished with Mrs. German, of course, and worked for my son Roger, and then in turn worked for the boys for a while, didn't he?
Well, somebody had to teach him.
He taught us.
He taught me
everything.
He's a great little guy.
Yeah, he's several $1 million today. But what about Prohibition that you remember? What did you think when you heard it was coming? Were you worried about the hop industry, or you knew you could still sell, or?
Yeah, we were all
Mhm.
concerned and wondered what it was going to do to the hop business, whether we'd be in business or not. But we seemed to survive some way or other.
I know my dad and Claude held over a crop, didn't sell it one year in 32 or whenever Roosevelt was coming in, and sold 2 crops in 33. And I know what hops were 15 cents or something, and they went up then to, I think, about 36 cents. And my grandfather, who was a Marion County commissioner, came down and told them one day, well, 36 cents, that's an awful lot of money, boys. And they says, well, we better sell them. So they sold them, and I think in a month they were up to 60 cents, which is kind of normal.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But 36 cents was quite a price, and to have 2 years'
Yeah.
crop.
There is, of course, the governor's mansion, as it's called, and I wouldn't say it's a mansion, but Mahonia Hall. And there's a Lively building downtown, the tallest building.
Oh, yeah.
There's a house that my neighborhood has been helping to restore, Northeast Neighbors, called the Buckner House.
I've heard the name.
And any of you remember him? He was listed in the Marion Polk Directory in 1929 simply as a capitalist. And he had a hardware store where the paper mill is, and then he'd begun, I guess, buying and selling hops.
In the home of Reatha Johnson. Mrs. Johnson is 94 years old, and I think we can assume you're not going to be around another 50 years or so. So what we want you to do, if you would please, is just try to recall living here in the middle of hop country and devoting your lives and your husband's lives to the production of hops, and some of the stories you can recall about how people spent their spare time. I know you mentioned a ballroom as part of the hops barn and so forth that we went by a while ago. I'd love to hear about that.
It showed them the Oregon Hop Company, Sid Back's place.
What about it?
Well, you know, I showed them where it was when we went on the bridge.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Well, that ranch was built up with high water. They had high water cattle barns and everything because we had terrible floods there until Detroit Dam.
It was owned, when she was a little girl, by Sid Backs. They were Chinese. They lived in Portland.
How do you
Well, I
spell
was
their
a-
name? Do you know?
Huh?
But
How do you spell their name?
Sidback, S-E-I-D. Isn't that the way you spell it?
S-E-I-D, B-A-C-K. Sid was given their last name, Back, Sid Back, and Sid Gain was his son that had the ones in the fence. Sid Back had the hop yard. That's when I was little, you know, in South Prairie, and my dad was helped manage that place. And we brought the pickers at that time, whole families from Portland, and they had tents for them to live in. And we went down, we'd hitch up the hay rack and go down there at the steamboat landing, at Spong's Landing or Simon's Landing, and pick up the pickers and bring them to the hop yard.
That's behind Kaiser. You know where Spawn's Landing was? Down towards Mission Bottom where the river That was way before my time now.
Yeah, and then in the teens, then they started building cabins then for the hop yards for the pickers to live in. And then they'd have a big pile of fresh wheat straw brought in, you know, with big stacks for their bedding, you know, for in. And it was all just big families that came.
They had big bonfires.
Men, there wasn't two men in that time, in the wartime, because just the women and children, and they came out to make money for their school clothes, you know, and for the winter. And then the men would come out weekends and help them work. And
Bring them supplies, some supplies that, you know, that they didn't have out there.
yeah. And then we went, that was in the later days, probably in the 20s, and we'd go to the Oregon Electric Railway to pick up the hop pickers and take them to the fields, but we always had to go and get them.
We went to Portland, you know, Otis went 2 years in a row, and he picked up, that was when we were on the Catlin place, and this was probably in the 30s. Well, he went to Portland and he picked them up and brought them out. And then people used to come every year. They'd want their same cabins, and
Yeah, they were just down at home there.
and then, like she said, that there'd be women that they were housewives, and they'd say, well, they were on vacation, and so they come out there and they brought their children, and they had a lot of fun. Like I said, they had we had bonfires, and we had now like on. Oh, do you remember any dances they had at the Oregon Hopping Company, and then big dance in the big dance hall?
Oh yeah, they'd have dances Saturday night. They had local some violin players and things in that. And we always had a big bonfire down by the river. It's right by the river, you know. And
How long did the harvest take? Weeks? Months?
it usually started. The pickers came in about the 29th of August usually, and then it lasted till 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes longer, depends. Usually it started to rain, and then they picked in the rain. One year we picked in with raincoats and rain hats.
Oh, yeah.
Because it just didn't quit raining, and we had to get the hops off, you know.
Well, they picked the fuggles first.
Yeah,
They
well,
picked
the early hops.
what they called early hops. They were a lighter type of hop, a bigger hop, and they were lighter. And they picked them first, and then maybe some growers went right into their late hops, and maybe their late hops weren't ready, and they'd have to wait. And then they'd pick the late hops. And picking them was a real.
And it was all done with horses. No machinery. Well, they did have the machinery for plowing, a tractor later, but it was all housework, or horse work. And I drove the horses and hauling spray dope to spray the hops, and drove them for high sled training. You know, we had to have high sleds and train on the wire. And I drove just practically all through the hop yards through the years.
Well, when they started out in the spring, if you will get that knife over there.
Well, my dad,
Just get that knife, and we'll tell you about that. Early in the spring, when they had to put strings on the wires. Well, I think that their family was probably the only one that used something like this. And you had a ball, and it weighed about a pound and a half. And you know, you pull the string out just like you do your yarn, you know, it had to come out. Well, what they did was you thread this and threw it over the wire and caught it and made a knot in it, slide up. Then you'd cut this off after you put it on the peg, because the pegs were already in the ground. They had to put pegs in there every year where the peg had come out. And then she was an expert at it, an absolute expert. And then I think she could throw this over before she even back up. And sometimes they only used one wire, one string, and then some of them used two, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
They had two strings. You had to put, you know, about 18, 20 inches apart up there. And she could just do it real.
my aunt, when I was little, she threw a ball. It's about that big around, about a pound, and you had to throw that over the wire, and it's so hard to throw it. Sometimes it go over 2 wires, you know.
Oh.
And well, my dad watched him a while, and he said that's just silly to be throwing that ball over the wire. So we cut the leg off the overalls and made a bag, you know, and we put a couple of balls in that bag. Then all you had to do is just throw this over the wire and stoop over and cut it off, and got your knife on there and everything. He made it.
Yeah. I don't know what became.
Razor blade or
It's made out of oak. She's been lucky to keep hers. I don't know whatever happened. And I wasn't very good at it, but she was, and she did, you know, it was all done by contract too, you know. They didn't pay you by the hour for this, they give you so much an acre. So she would cut me out an acre in this, and there were several, she had a couple of sisters, and so one of her sisters said to me, you know, you better watch her, she's the pencil pusher. You're not going to get and I didn't know what she meant, you know, because she
well,
said,
there's 680 hills to the acre, and they figured that I cut them out more than 680 to kind of make a little bit on them, but I didn't though.
no, she was as honest as the day is
But I
long.
had the
But
contact
I didn't
her.
know this, but I always thought it was real big, you know, and she'd say, well, now when you get that done, kid, well, then you'll have an acre and you'll have so much money, and then I'll cut you out another one. And here she would just be going circles around me, going circles around. Oh gosh, it was a lot of fun. And then later, you see, when then you had to go through them and you trained them up. And then, the hill, it'd just be a nasty big bunch of vines, and you had to pick out the vines that you wanted to train on these strings, and then you stripped them down, and then you had to clean this all of the rest of them out. You had hop knives, and people worked, you know, with knives. Well, then when they got so far up, why, they just went up themselves, didn't they? So you might go out there and, you know, touch up a few of them, and then when they got up, like she said, well, then they had sleds that you went through the rows, and then you trained them on the wires. And that was a lot of fun.
And then they got later when they began using that, cut them off. You didn't use pickers anymore. No. They just let them hang, you know.
No, they didn't train them up there.
They didn't train them on
they had, by that time, then they, well then, right after they had that kind of balls, well then we had strings that we wrapped all around us. And then we walked down the road. They left the wires down then. And then you walked down.
And they were like a rope. They were rough.
Well, no, I'm talking about the strings that we used to cut. They weren't. They were almost like what was in the ball.
Well, the ones that I used was just like rope material. They were awful rough. They used to made my neck sore.
Oh yes, that when we went into that like jute.
Yeah.
You know, when we went into that, it was real bad. And then they used sleds. They used sleds to put that real heavy stuff on.
Now, were the horses, were the sleds horse-drawn?
Oh yes,
Uh-huh.
you had a.
And you rode on the sled, and you
have,
propelled through down the path.
Was there two?
She didn't. I did.
No, I never was up on the
We
sled.
trained
I
on
wasn't
2
good.
wires at a time, you know.
I never did much in the hops. By the time that. Well,
I did everything from painting the male hops. You had to go through painting them, so I don't know which one to blow out with dynamite. I even cut the dynamite. It sticks in half to blow out those things out of the ground. And then I did everything.
What'd you blow them things out of there for?
Well, because they're no good. The male.
Well, I know that. You only had to
They have just so many, you know, for an acre, and the ones that they don't bear hops.
No.
They just kind of have fuzzy bloom. So you have to blow them out. They could dig them out, but they just stick that little stick of dynamite on there and just light that fuse, and it blows them clear out, root and all. So there's no root left there.
Then after when they went to putting them on that way, why, then later why we went to picking them by machine, but then they estimated hops. You know, they'd go through a field the men did that, you know, they'd estimate how many bales they were gonna have, because they baled them, you know, in about 200 pounds. And remember when I got the pretty velvet, pretty shoes from Mrs. Spears?
Yeah.
We were down in a field, for some reason or another, why, I said, how many bales we were gonna get off of that field. I forget the amount, but I lacked just one bale of coming out right, and my brother was the one, this Kathy's father, he was the one that baled hops there. And so when they came up to the house and told him how many bales that they had, he turned around and he looked at me and then he looked at them and he said, now Lordy, he said, did you skimp on? No, he came out even, I guessed. And he said, did you skimp on all the bales? He said, so that she could get those shoes she wants. And he said, what shoes? What shoes? I didn't hear nothing about any shoes, Lloyd said, which he didn't. He didn't know what he was talking about. But Mrs. Spears gave me a pair of shoes I got at Price's. And anyway, when I said it, why, my husband said, you better not tell her that, because he said, you don't know how expensive shoes she'll buy. She said, oh, I don't care. She said, you can have the best shoes there is. She said, if we get that many bales. Well, we did get that many bales, but that was a lot of fun. But like I say, they contracted them early in the spring.
Now, you worked then for the owners of the hop yards, the Spears.
The Frank Spears, well, he managed, would you say he managed it for his mother-in-law? His mother-in-law owned it.
Yeah, and then he worked for Prudential Insurance.
Prudential, and wasn't it Billy Walton that
Billy
owned?
Walton owned the Oregon Hop.
Yeah, see, after the,
It was Sidback, old man Sidback owned the hop yard down in South Prairie for years, and then later years, his son took over in this Independence yard. That's young Sid Gayton that was there. And then his dad went and remarried, and when his dad died, that woman that his dad remarried went and borrowed all the money that she could borrow on that ranch and built a big hotel over at Seaside and moved over there, and Sid Gayton lost the Oregon Hop Company took over, bought it. But she did that. She just mortgaged the whole thing, so he lost that.
When you said you went to Portland to get some pickers who came down with families and everything, did those families commit themselves ahead of time that I'll be back next year?
oh yes, they'd write to you, you know, and tell you that they were coming and to preserve them a cabin.
Were they any special nationality?
No, they were just
all
kinds.
all kinds.
It
and
seemed to be an awful lot of German
Really?
people.
you,
I had a long list of names. We had 350 pickers, and I had a big long list. And every year the same ones would write. I want to know when it was going to start, so I can notify them when
They'd
they come.
come.
We had the same ones over and over.
they'd
for
come sometimes
several
even a
years.
week before. You remember when the Dust Bowl was on and they were parked on the river? You remember when they parked on the river that year?
Well, you mean when all those bums and winos and all that stuff was down there?
No. These were people that come from Oklahoma and that, and they were on the riverbank.
Oh,
Don't you remember that? When they had to have cops out there so that they wouldn't flood the fields. They left so many go in the morning and then so many in the afternoon to pick.
we had so much trouble in hot picking time, we probably didn't have time to.
Well, I remember that. I remember that distinctly. That's before even Marvin was born. They camped along the riverbank.
I know there was a lot of them over there. There were a lot of winos and there were people but they weren't.
And then her and
They were nice people. They were just a bunch of winos and well, we called them Okies and Arkies is what we called them.
Well,
because they just didn't live like we did.
That
That one year, why it was, I don't know. That just that one year that they bothered.
I was thinking of something and then I lost my.
When you
Right.
said there were like 350 pickers coming, did you have to run out and put tents up and hay in the tents
No,
before they got here?
as they came, we issued them a tent,
Ah,
and then they could put it wherever they wanted to. But later, there wasn't very many tents used.
No.
They started building
They
those
just-
cabins.
did you have a store?
Oh,
Yes, I had a store.
And I had
a
one too.
commissary.
The first year we had a store at the Oregon Hop Company.
What all did you sell at the store?
We sold just groceries like you run to the
Bread and milk and eggs?
bread and milk and some canned stuff, and then meat. The butcher in Independence, he brought fresh meat over every day.
We sold
he
ice
bring it.
cream.
And
I bet that was
then
good.
at the latter few years, I sold beer,
Yeah.
keg beer, you know. Bottled beer too, but
We
I had
bought
a
our-
beer license. I
We bought our
sold.
groceries from Willamette Grocery and also Fred Meyer's. We bought them 1 or 2 years when Fred Meyer's first went into Salem. Well, then they sold us groceries. And, well, we made a little bit. We made more than we would if we worked. And then also her and I, we paid the pickers. We were the ones that cashed in their
Paid.
tickets.
Boy, in the old days, it was something to see him pay pickers. An old man Sidback, he'd have a 6-gun laying on each side of his head, and piles of $20 and $10 and $5 bills and all kinds, all cash, just laying all over the table. And them 2 6-shooters sitting there like this, and the people paying off. He never did have no trouble.
But they were Chinese and they
Really?
used that, what do you call it?
Abacus.
Yeah, they use that for their ad machines, and
Do you ladies have any pictures of any of these things you've been talking about?
well, I got a few of them, not very many.
Would you have a picture of the store?
I don't think we even took a picture of the store. We were too busy that time.
I had a picture at home, but then it was when the guys had their now.
Oh, I've probably got
This
a
is
lot of
her.
pictures around that.
Uh-huh.
And
Oh,
her
there's a
sister
nice hop
Jewel.
barn in the back.
And this is a house that's on that place that I showed you,
Uh-huh.
and this is the hop house. And then, now this is me picking hops. And,
I see you had long sleeves.
mhm.
And
Oh, yes, and another
Stuff was
thing,
scratchy, wasn't it?
yeah, they were scratchy, and she picked without gloves. And most people that really knew how to
Don't
pick.
drop and everything. I've had these laying in the bottom of a drawer, and this is a picture of that right across the river from Independence.
What I showed you.
The bridge.
Uh-huh.
That's the
Jesus,
where
shame
we.
it's faded. Oh, I'm sorry, John, I'm standing right in front of you.
And this was the Chinaman that run that for a good many years for Sidback. And
His name was Lop Singh.
and this is part of the pickers out in the guy came out in the yard one time and had over half of them piled up there so that he could take
Oh,
a
that
picture.
must be why I've seen so many pictures of groups of pickers.
Yeah.
A camera went
A
around
cameraman
and
would
farmed
come in, you know, to take, because he could sell them, you know, around here and
Sure.
make the money. And that was just the top,
Oh,
just
my,
pictures
look
of
at
tops
that.
of the hop. Boy, they had beautiful hop
Boy, is that lush.
fields.
You know,
Oh, doggone.
You know who that
Possibly
is?
get this, John.
The back of somebody?
It's just hard to
That's
tell.
Bud. Weighing up
Yeah.
and then they have,
Well, that brown thing there, that top brown thing there, right in that, there's some pictures of, shows that big thing that well, here. No, that's the wrong one. But I've seen those pictures, I was looking the other day, and well, now, I suppose I can't find them just because.
Well, here, you show me yours, for her
Well,
while
this
she's
is,
finding?
this is her brother, and see, he was
Oh,
a
he's-
checker. They had
uh-huh.
checkers that went through. And she had a jumbo, a picture of a jumbo, but they put the hops through a jumbo so they could see whether they were picked clean, because they weren't supposed to have too many big leaves and big
Well,
big
maybe
stems
this
in
was
them.
the wrong
And then
one.
they weighed them, and then they punched a ticket. The amount, some people put the amount of money that it was on there,
Oh,
and some
no.
people
There they
were just
were.
pounds, how many pounds you had. At times they paid like 25 cents a basket or like that, or then they just give you a ticket. And that was, and they always had about 3 men, and this was a tripod that they packed, and then they had another, just like this big jumbo. Have you got the big, there it is. Yes, she's got better pictures. This is the jumbo, that's her young brother, and that's how they put him in there. And, oh gee, you got a picture of me and Tilly and all of
And
them.
that's the floods that used to be there at that ranch. Shows the top of the hop cabins, you see the top of the cabins out at the top of the water. They were all underwater. And our house was built up 8 feet off the ground, and the water was clear up on the porch. Just didn't have a dry step on the porch.
She had a duck.
16 steps up.
Yeah, she had a duck that took her bandy hands across that chicken's right on the back. That bandy hen raised that duck. What was his name?
The goose.
A goose, but what was his name?
Henry.
Henry.
Yeah, the Banny hen set on 2 goose eggs and she hatched one of them. I had a picture of my dad laying kills, but my dad laid the kills, they laid them
This was
about
a picture of my husband,
30 inches or
He's a
3 feet
handsome guy.
deep.
and this was his young brother. And that was his brother's wife. And that's
Well, where did the pickers go when the flood came?
Oh, they didn't
Oh,
live there.
Oh,
that was
that was
winter.
the wrong
That-
time of year.
That
Uh-huh.
was winter.
This would happen in the early springs and in winter time. The big floods like, well, this one was in 43, it was June the 1st. That's when we went down over the,
January.
January.
Yeah, it was New Year's Day. The night before, my dad went down to the river, and he says, honey, the water's coming up 1 inch an hour. And he says, we're really going to get it tonight. Well, then by morning, there was wood bumping our floor underneath. And we had lime. We always put lime in all the cabins, to keep. Well, he put the lime down in the basement and the tent over the top of them to keep them so dry. And it got wet and started a fire. And the house was just full of smoke. And so my son that was at home then, he run down the steps in the basement in water about that deep. Ice cold water, the river had come over. And that was on the 1st of January, 43.
Are you too high here for the river to get you?
Yeah.
Oh,
we did.
yes.
If it ever got here, why we
Since the Green Peter Dam went in 60-something, well, we don't have high water anymore.
the Detroit dams when they came in, why we had high water quit. But
We
they
went over-
used to, you could go from where the bridge is now, Independence, straight across to that hill to Orville Station with a rowboat, right clear across the hop yards of the rowboat.
Oh, it was real deep, where we went up on the bridge. Oh, that used to be just real deep with, all the houses in there were all high water houses.
Yeah.
They were.
Well, tell me more about the campfires and dances and some of the things that made the people come back every year after year. I know it was more than the money.
Well, really what made the people come back, they were families, it was hard times, and they came back to earn money for their winter and for their children's
Yes.
clothing and stuff. That's why they came back. The people, you'd think it'd just be the young people that'd be having the fun. And I was in on that, with the campfires and wiener rolls and everything to entertain them, see. and that'd be down on the riverbank.
Uh-huh.
And one good thing about where we was, you could pick hops all day and you'd be sweating and you could just run down and jump in the river. That's what we did in the evening, just run down there and jump in the river.
When we were on the Catlin place too, Mr. Spears, the man.
Now,
that
where
owned-
was that?
That was where Kathy lives down there.
Oh,
Where they've
uh-huh.
turned all that into, well, that was what we called the Russell
Wells
Catlin.
Landing.
Down in there. Why, Mr. Spears then at the end of hop picking, why then he would have ice cream for the children and the ladies and a beer for the men. And that was his treat right after hop picking. But most of the hop companies, they didn't do that because they had a lot of people, but we did have a lot of people. Because we raised more than, like I said, we raised more. Because we
But
had
now Wells
asparagus,
Landing.
strawberries, beans.
Well,
cherries,
landing
hops.
is another boat landing along that river, see, that they went clear to Eugene. With, and that was another station where they, Buena Vista is an old town. It's, and they had 3 stores there, a big general store, and they had the pottery plants, and I don't know what they're in Buena Vista. And you see all the, everything come by boat down that river. There was no train or nothing. And trucks, you know, that just wasn't those days. So that old river was pretty important.
It was a highway.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, it was. What was Stranger? That was one of the boats' names, wasn't it? Stranger?
Yeah, there were several.
Didn't they,
big-
haven't they,
Dredged?
no, but haven't they restored that?
Oh,
that-
not in the Willamette Valley that I know of.
On the river, what's the boat that they have down in Portland? Did they,
Oh, one they just call the Queen of the Columbia Gorge, but there is another one. What's the name of that other steamboat? Do you recall? I'm sorry. I don't think it's Stranger though. I believe I'd remember it.
remember how it used to toot his horn?
Uh-huh.
See,
Yeah, we kids used to run down to we lived close to the river, see the big steamboats go by.
Oh my, what a
And hear
nice.
that old whistle. It's just like, do you ever get lonesome to hear the old train whistle
Uh-huh.
that used to go through the valley? I remember in school days to hear that old train coming. Well, that's the way the old boat was when I was
yeah.
little, to hear the old steamboat
She was
whistle.
born down in,
Where, I was just gonna ask you, where were you born?
Do you know where Wakanda is?
Wakanda?
Wakanda?
Uh-huh, yes.
Well, you know, it's, between Wakanda and Hot Mirror, my dad built
I know where Outmere is too.
built a log cabin there, and I was
Is
born there, and
that
Uncle
right?
Billy Egan's ranch.
you know, the Egan.
Yes,
Did
we
you
know
know
the
the
Egan.
Egans?
I was,
Well, Uncle
Well, they
Billy
were,
Egan, my dad built a log cabin there on his place. We
She
lived-
tied
I
strings
was
for
born
the
there.
Eganses when she was young, when they lived down there. And,
Mr. Egan, we were talking to him a couple of months ago, and he said he had a group of Italian families,
Uh-oh.
a whole neighborhood of Italian people that
Oh.
liked to come to his place because they could all pick together, and they let them have their own hop yard, and they jabber back and forth and just have the best time all day long. And what he
Well-
liked about it was their kids knew all different kinds of ways of getting in trouble that he had never heard of before.
Well, now Uncle
well,
Billy
you know,
Egan.
the Egan you're talking about, my brother used to babysit him and Adele
Is
when we lived down there. And when I went down there a couple of years ago to buy some flowers down there, I mentioned it to Adele because Adele, met her again at the Spearses' home because the Spearses knew her. And then I mentioned my brother. Oh, she says, I remember Gordon. So, but she was a little tiny girl. But what would you, the man that you call Uncle Billy Egan, what would they be to Homer's children? His group, about great-great-great-uncle or something?
Well, it was in 19,
Or was
well,
it
when
just-
I was a little kid, Uncle Billy was 45, 50 years old, so
Well, was it their
That
grandfather,
would be their
great-grandfather?
grandpa.
Was it their great-grandfather or something?
I don't know, but they owned that place there at Hot Mirror, and
Was
it
he Albert's
was,
dad?
it was a real circus they had peacocks, deer, they had everything imaginable there. The whole.
Who is this now?
Uncle Billy Egan.
Oh.
And they used to all go, neighbors and people went all around to see their place.
Well, it would be related to this.
It would be Homer Egan's dad, whoever. Do you know Homer Egan?
No, I know Adele and I
And
know
Albert,
Bill.
did you know Albert?
No.
Well, Adele is Homer's daughter.
Well, so it'd be her grandfather then.
It'd be her
Uncle
grandfather.
Billy.
It would be her grandfather. And he had a place down in Wakanda too, or you said
Yeah.
something about him.
Well, they owned, they were brothers, you know, Uncle Billy and Mike.
Yeah.
Then what brought you over down this close to the river? When you married, did you?
When I married a Nebraska farmer, rancher, and we went back there for 2 years, and then we came back, and then he learned to be a Oregonian. But,
Well, you had a good teacher.
yeah.
Yeah.
But see, me, I was, my dad was always in the hop yard.
You know, this ring I have, my husband found that in a hop yard when he was a little boy. And it has initials in there. And I don't know, I can't read, I think it's either 1903. And when we got married in 31, he wanted me to be married in it. No, I couldn't see that, you know. He wore it on his little finger. Well, then when we were married 25 years, my ring had worn real thin, and so I asked him if I could have it, and he said, well, I think after 25 years you earned it. So I had to have it made smaller, but some poor lady lost it in the hop yard. Do you remember when he found it, or how old he was? He just said to me, I don't remember how old I was, but he said I was just a little boy when I found it. So
Well, when did things change in the valley and the hop stopped being the king?
Well, it was two
late
or 3 years before we left the Oregon. I'd say about 38, between 38 and 40, after the war. The hops, now this outfit that we was with, Sidbeck, he held the hops, they was gonna go to $1. You know, that was after when things were getting high. But they didn't go to $1. So the next year, they used them for fertilizer. They broke those bales open and used them for fertilizer in the field. They wouldn't order them anything, they offered them 85 cents, and they wouldn't take it. They was waiting for $1, so they lost them. And after that, it seemed like the prices kept going down, and it costs about 50 cents a pound to raise them. Well, then, you know, everybody was just going out of hops. You just couldn't keep them going. Well, by the time we left the Oregon hop, we could have bought that ranch for $25,000. But my husband says, yeah, you buy that ranch, and he says, they said you could pay for it, you know, by the income, but he says, hops and price is getting worse all the time, so we got out. Because it was getting, well then just shortly after we got out, then they quit, they couldn't get help in the hop yard. The last 2 years we was there, you had to beg for help. The old customers, the people that we could rely on year after year did our work, they wouldn't come back. They got on welfare, and if they get off of welfare, they couldn't get back on. So we had to take new help that knew nothing about the hops or nothing. So it was just really getting rough. And that's why they started going out of the hop business.
Well, we still had hops when Nora was born in the 50s.
Yeah.
They still had hops on the Catlin place, because they'd already moved. But like I said, then the hops, we said the bottom went out of hops.
Yeah.
But they did get
They just
a
wanted to make
disease. They did get a disease too, you know.
Yeah,
that,
this downy mildew was brought in from Canada with hop roots from Canada, downy mildew. And they would be, the hops would just be gorgeous, and then these new things would come out, those new growth, it just turn yellow and just kind of, well, you know, like to do it on roses, that's what. Then we had to hire let the wire down so they could reach the hops and hire people to come and cut that off all over the hops, because it's ruined the hops.
Yeah.
Everything was going wrong.
You had the government had you pour some kind of stuff around the crown of the hops, and I
Well,
know
that was
Otis
to-
said
that was to
that's
kill weeds,
gonna eat the
kill grass.
hops up, and then we, like I said, why the woman sold the place, and so we moved across the river. But they were we lived there on the Catlin place for over 20 years. That my husband run it, and
Uh-oh. I'm gonna throw that thing away. Just
Oh,
leave it, I'll find
I
it.
got it. They were
That,
really a lovely bunch of people, or I mean, people to work for. And Sybil is still alive, and her brother is, he's a lawyer, Sonny Spears. We called him Sonny Spears. His name is Frank Spears Jr., and he's a lawyer in Portland. And but Sybil lives over there in West Salem. She lives up there where Ruthie lives. It's out Wallace Road where there's it's a home, a bunch of group homes.
Salem Town.
Salem Town, I think that's where she lives. And she was a school teacher for years. She
Before we tire you out completely, tell me about World War II and what it was like for your families. I know you were telling me a story about having the soldiers help you harvest the
yes,
beans.
we had them. Like I said, we had. It was a government contract, and so we had to get the soldiers from Camp Adair, and they couldn't take any food off of the camp, but they could go if somebody came after them. So we had a picnic on the front lawn. They picked, and I made coffee in a copper boiler. We had the old one of the camp stoves from one of the cabins, and then we had. I still have it, the crock cutter that her father used to make sauerkraut on. And we made cold slaw.
Huh.
And Mrs. Spears got the meat that we made, and she roasted it. But we had a lot of soldiers. We had lots of them. And then they came all for straggle to pick beans after that, because you see they could earn money by picking beans. And I don't know how much they made a day, but we did have bean pickers that made an awful lot. Now she made good picking hops because she could really pick them, but Otis always used to tell the checkers to watch her. He always thought she was going to pick them dirty, And when you picked them by hops by the basket, why, when you get the basket so far, then you start going down and you raise them up, and holler, weigh them up, and then the checkers would come see, and you'd have it up to the top. But when you got paid by the pound, why, then you smashed them down, and they didn't want you to smash them down like that. And
I think Mrs. Johnson's getting a little tired.
Oh, no, I'm not tired. It might be too warm.
Well, if we go, you can take off some clothes and no one will be
Oh.
wet. I want to thank you ladies so much for getting together today, for letting us film it. I'm sure parts of it will end up in the movie on hops.
well, I'd sure like to see that.
Well, when and if we get it together, we'll sure let you know.
Yes.
Or we will get it together probably by September, hopefully.
It's too bad we
Is
couldn't
it
get.
through public broadcasting? Is that what it's?
No, we probably will show the video down at the Marion County Historical Society.
Oh.
Down by Mission Mill, and it probably will end up on CCTV, which is a Salem Public Access Channel.
Oh.
What number is it now? 34?
25.
25. Do you have cable? You have to have cable to
No,
No.
I don't get it. She doesn't. I don't. Do you get? Do you get it?
But my husband, that was Chris Johnson. He's just known all over the whole country with the hop. So it was Chris Johnson. So it was quite a